welcome to the second second session, if you will, of the Distinguished Environmental Speaker Series for this year. Today's presentation, Thinking and Acting Locally About the Global Climate Crisis, is an important and timely talk about an important topic. You may have seen today that the Pew Research Survey issued its new survey on climate change and what Americans think. And for the first time in the two-decade history of the survey, a majority of Americans said dealing with climate change should be a top priority for the president and for Congress. This is up 14 points from 4 years ago. And it's a good thing because greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are higher now than they've been in 800,000 years. We're actually looking at something that is not just important for this decade or next decade, but something that could be have an impact for a long, long time to come. Now, the American Bar Association adopted a resolution this past summer urging all levels of government, as well as the private sector, to recognize their obligation to address climate change and to take action to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions to net zero or below as soon as possible, consistent with the latest peer-reviewed science. And so when we talk about all levels of government, local government is certainly an important part of that. I should tell you that I edited a book that was published about a year ago in which we looked at, Professor Michael Gerard and I asked contributing lawyers, practicing lawyers and academic lawyers from all over the country about what can be done to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, and they came up with about 1,500 legal recommendations. These are federal, state, local, and private. And so there are hundreds of choices, really, that local governments have in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions within their boundaries. Professor Sinden, and for those of you who are active on this, the thing you ought to know is that there is an index of recommendations by actor at the back of the book, so you don't have to read the whole book to find all the recommendations that are applicable to local governments. So we know, as a starting point, that local governments have a lot of choices. Professor Sinden is a professor of law at Temple University, Beasley School of Law. She's on the board of directors at the Center for Progressive Reform, which is identified on the slide behind me. She writes and teaches in the areas of environmental property, climate, natural resources law, and her articles have appeared in a great many academic books and journals. She's also, and I'm jealous of this, has published in a number of popular news outlets, including the American Prospect. Professor Sinden received her BA from Swarthmore and her JD summa cum laude from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Before joining the Temple faculty in 2001, she practiced for 10 years, including representing citizen groups in Clean Water Act and endangered species litigation with two organizations. One is Earthjustice, the other PennFuture. It's also a pleasure to have Amy here because we've known each other for a long time. We continue to work with organizations that are trying to engage lawyers, practicing lawyers on climate change. That's about all I think I want to say. Please welcome Amy Sinden.
Good afternoon. Hi. How is everybody? Boy, I got to crane my neck in this room. It's like a full half circle. This is what John was just talking about. And John, I do want to thank you for having me. As John said, we've known each other a long time. He's been a dear friend. And then I realized, as I was getting ready for this week, I actually haven't been out to this campus before. I've been to the Widener campus in Westchester. So it's a real pleasure to be out here for the first time. And I hope to be back. John mentioned that CO2 levels in the atmosphere are higher than they've been in 800,000 years. Here's the chart that a very diligent scientist on the top of Mauna Loa in Hawaii started keeping in the late 1950s, just painstakingly tracking what's the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and you just see it sort of marching inexorably upward. And of course, as CO2 levels do that, so does Oh, well, this is interesting. So does the temperature. Oh, here we go. I need to use the mouse here. And this is sort of a nice animation, I think, that's going to illustrate for us the rise in global temperatures over the past century plus, well, plus 20 years now. You can't read it from where you're sitting, but all those words around the outside are countries, are the countries of the world. And the corresponding sticks sticking out from the middle are temperature records for a given year for that country. So it's kind of giving you a sense of the overall state of temperature for the entire globe over the past 120 years. And so if I can get the animation to go, it goes like that. There we go. So as CO2 levels have risen, so are temperatures inexorably rising year after year. And of course, as average temperatures rise, we're seeing increasingly the planet let loose a litany of catastrophes that sound like some kind of apocalyptic story from the Bible, right? Fires and floods and storms, famine, drought, disease, resource shortages that will trigger increasingly mass migration, political instability, war. There's just a sort of never-ending series of these catastrophes in the news, maybe the latest really big one being the terrible bushfires in Australia, thought now to have killed literally over 1 billion animals, not even to mention the loss of human life involved. But to just sort of stop and ponder that for a moment is really quite profound, and perhaps we don't know yet how many of the unique species that inhabited the Australian continent have been wiped out by these unprecedented fires. So, you can be forgiven for feeling a bit of whiplash in the last few years as these various disasters have unfolded. And of course, it's not just me saying this. The pile of sort of official government scientific reports detailing the causes and the effects of climate change all around the world is at this point huge. This is the 4th National Climate Assessment that was actually put out by something like a dozen different federal agencies, actually during the Trump administration, and details all of the effects that we can expect to see in quite a bit of detail for different regions of the United States in particular. This is just the latest of a whole series of reports that have been put out by the Department of Defense, starting at least in the George W. Bush administration. The Pentagon has recognized for decades now that climate change is a real threat. I mean, not only to their military bases around the world that are in, for example, low-lying areas that are going to be subject to sea level rise, but also because of what I was saying earlier about these impacts of climate change triggering political instability and mass migration and war and so on. And this is something that the Pentagon has been documenting and discussing in a whole series of reports. And then, of course, we should mention the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's report from 2018 that got a lot of press, and I think in some ways is responsible for some of that bump in public opinion that John was just talking about. This came out in the fall of 2018, and this slide, this is a quote from the report, and of course the IPCC, is this international body that's made up of virtually all the countries in the world, and they come out with these reports periodically, and they're put together by sort of all the major climate scientists from all around the globe. But as I say, the organization is an organization of countries, and these are consensus documents. So literally all the countries have to sign on. But they are written the way scientists write, right? So, I mean, you're reading this, you're kind of like, oh, it's not all that dramatic. But I mean, this is what it looks like when a bunch of scientists are literally like freaking out. Like they're freaking out at this point. And they're like, and if you look at the words there, what they're saying is pretty profound. I mean, they're essentially saying that we have about 10 years to literally like turn this oil tanker that is the global economy that has for over a century been based on and powered by fossil fuels, to sort of turn that oil tanker around so that we get our energy from non-fossil fuel sources that don't put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And you see them talking there. These are transitions that are unprecedented in terms of scale and imply deep reductions in all sectors of the economy. I mean, it gives us some sense of just what a profound change we're looking at, right? And of course, it's a change that is going to happen eventually, the shift from a fossil fuel-powered economy to an economy that's powered by green energy. I think the question that we face right now is just, are we going to do it sooner rather than later? And will we do it soon enough to stave off the most frightening effects of climate change? Because essentially what the IPCC is saying here is that if we don't start to make this shift in the next 10 years, we have very little hope of keeping overall climate change to the 2 degree or 1.5 degree thresholds that scientists have said we should be aiming for. And once we get beyond those thresholds, we're really looking at significant risks of triggering the kinds of negative feedback loops that can send the climate sort of out of control in a way that simply could not be remedied. So one response to all of this is to say, well, you know, where is all this greenhouse gas coming from in terms of the various countries of the world? And sometimes people look at a chart like this, right, which is essentially showing us year by year the share of greenhouse gas emissions from each country in the world. And we see China with the biggest share, 28%. And so there's often a tendency to point to this and say, aha, see, it's all China's fault, and why should we bother to do anything here? Because China's going to make a mess of everything anyway, right? Shouldn't we make sure China's going to clean up their act before we do anything? The problem with that, of course, is that China is at 28% to our 15%, but China has 2 billion people to our what? We have like 350 million or something in this country. And so when you look at it a different way, when you look, for example, at historical emissions, so this chart is telling us, well, over time, given like all the greenhouse gases that we've put into the atmosphere, which many of them stay there for decades or centuries, who's responsible for them over time? And we, of course, are responsible for the lion's share, being the biggest of the industrialized economies that industrialized early, right? And so that gives us a sense of why others in the world are sort of looking to the United States to act first on this problem, because there's a very compelling argument that says we are, more than any other country, the ones who caused it, both in terms of responsibility for sort of the cumulative total of these gases that are currently in the atmosphere, but also if you look per capita, right? So you could think of the global atmosphere as a sort of commons, right, that we have now recognized has limited capacity to absorb greenhouse gases. And you could say, you know, the sort of right or entitlement to fill up that commons with greenhouse gases ought to be divided in some way among the people of the world, it's hard to sort of justify a way of dividing it other than to say, well, each person you would think should get an equal share. Well, by that kind of logic, we have already used up an awful lot of our share, right? So each person in the United States, per capita, our emissions are higher than any of the other big countries. They are actually more than 2 times the emissions in China, the per capita emissions in China, and more than 9 times the per capita emissions in India. Oh, well, before we get to that, how's everybody doing? Like, were you expecting cheerful? It's a scary picture. It's a scary picture, and I think that it's important to confront that. And I think that when we really, really think about what's going on, it feels overwhelming. It feels like we're sort of powerless. Like, what can we do about all of this, right? I mean, this is sort of the point where if I was a blog post, you would click on something else, right? or if I was at a cocktail party with you, you'd be like, excuse me, I have to go to the bathroom. And I think we can all be excused for sort of, to the extent, either trying to avoid the issue or maybe sinking into a puddle of despair if we start really confronting it and thinking about it. But at a certain point, we have to confront it or we have to come out of our puddle of despair, whichever place we are. And one of the things that I spend an awful lot of time thinking about is a couple of decades from now, when people look back, especially when people look back on this year, 2020, I think a lot of the noise by then will have cleared, the tweets and the, Democratic presidential candidates yelling at each other on the debate stage and so on and so forth. And I really think that our kids and our grandkids are really only going to have one question for us when they ask us about 2020. And that question is going to be, what did you do to stave off I hate to sound melodramatic, but it really is the worst catastrophe the human race has ever faced. And in many ways, right now in 2020, we are at an inflection point of historical proportions. So that's just kind of how I think of it. And so that does bring me to my kind of like, all right, so you're in your puddle of despair, and then you think, well, what am I going to say to my kids? And so you kind of get up and you say, all right, what am I going to do? And I do think we're all super busy and we all wake up every morning with a long to-do list we can't possibly finish and so on and so forth. But I think there are these 3 things that we can all find time to do. And the first one, of course, is to vote. We really are, certainly among the democracies on the planet, we are the one by any measure that's responsible for the biggest chunk of this problem, and I think that gives us sort of a special responsibility to go to the polls and use our rights as democratic citizens of this country to say to our elected representatives what the Pew poll that John just talked about at the beginning said, which is that increasingly all of us are recognizing that this needs to be a problem that's put at the top of our elected representatives' to-do list. To be fair, I think across the political spectrum, I do think that a lot of our elected representatives are a little bit behind where the general public is on this, but I think they are beginning to catch up. And I think, we certainly have seen a lot of discussion about it in the Democratic presidential debates and so on. And on the Republican side, we're increasingly seeing moves in Congress to come up with some real policy proposals on the Republican side to try to come up with, common sense, practical solutions to this problem. So that's thing 1, vote. But thing 2 is talk. And I say this because, Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old Swedish activist, one of the things she says that I just find so interesting is that when she first started learning about the climate crisis, I guess she was in like middle school or something, she says she didn't believe it. They're telling her about this, and she was like, well, that can't possibly be true, right? And the reason she couldn't believe it is because she said, well, if that were true, then everybody, all of the adults around me, and like all of the people, all of our elected representatives and the people running things and so on, they would be talking about it all the time. They would be talking about nothing else. And nobody's talking about it. So therefore, it must not be happening, right? And it is a strange phenomenon, like how little we talk about this problem given how important it is to sort of the continued future of our civilization. What an irony, right? That basically the weather has in some ways become no longer a safe topic of polite conversation. And so I've increasingly just been saying to people, let's just talk about it. Talk about it to your friends, talk about it to your family, talk about it to your Uber driver. If you, like me and John, are someone who's in front of classrooms of people, talk about it to your classes. I've been urging my colleagues at Temple Law School to talk about it in class because there actually literally is no law school class that doesn't in some way interface with this problem because it is so wide and pervasive, because it sort of impacts every aspect of our society and our legal system. And so that's thing number 2, talk. Let's just talk about it. Let's come out as people who believe the science and are concerned about the issue. And then the third thing is act. And of course, this goes back to the title of the talk. And it goes back to this slogan from when I was a kid in the 1970s that I really think is particularly apt today. Now, it begs the question, of course, like, why would we act locally about something that's happening on a global scale, right? Well, I'm doing everything in threes today, as you may have noticed. So I have 3 reasons why we should act locally. One is it's a crucial part of the solution, and I'll talk more about that. 2, it'll cheer you up. And 3, it'll make you less mad. So those are my 3 things. So, crucial part of the solution. So, in the early part of the environmental movement, when environmental law was first kind of becoming a thing after Congress passed all these statutes in the 70s, there were all these debates about, like, what is the correct level of government at which environmental regulation should take place? And it was these I've just got up here on the screen, like 2 of the classic law review articles in this area. And the first one, Dick Stewart writes in 1977, like literally right after all these big federal statutes have been passed. And he's taking, in some ways, it's complicated, but he, at least in parts of the articles, is sort of articulating what's sort of the liberal position, right? The liberals are all saying, federal government, you have to deal with these problems at the sort of highest level of collective action. And the conservatives are saying, no, it should be some smaller, it should be state government, it should be local government. And that's sort of exemplified by this Butler and Macy article that articulated this thing called the matching principle, that said the size of the geographic area affected by the particular pollutant source should determine what's the appropriate governmental level. And of course, back then we were talking about pollutants that were largely local in effect, right? And so you could see that this matching principle would in many instances lead to a conclusion that says, control over these environmental regulation really should be more at a local level or a state level. So then along comes the climate crisis. And the climate crisis in some ways is like, it's just a crisis for a law professor to love, because you couldn't make up like a better textbook example of the tragedy of the commons, right? Of this idea of like all these people trying to use a single open access resource, and if everybody just acts in their individual interest, you end up basically overusing and exploiting and destroying the resource. And of course, as we said, the global atmosphere is, in a sense, this big global commons, and the climate crisis is just the perfect example of this tragedy of the commons. But because it's global, right? I mean, every molecule of CO2 that we send up in the atmosphere it has the same impact on average global temperatures and the dynamic of the greenhouse effect, regardless of where in the globe it's been released, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it was released here in Harrisburg, or it was released in India, or it was released in Australia. It's going to have the same impact. So it's truly, truly a global problem. And if we go back to that matching principle, we see, it totally changes it. Because here we have a pollutant that affects, what's the geographic area affected by CO2? It's the globe, right? And so when you think about the climate crisis, and there's like basically, a whole bunch of different theories that you can throw at it that are basically different explanations for sort of the perverse collective dynamics that drive this kind of problem. And so you can call it a tragedy of the commons, or you can call it an externality problem, or a collective action problem, or a problem with public goods, or prisoner's dilemma, or a race to the bottom, and so on. But under all these different theories, basically, it's going to point toward, because it's this problem is happening at a global scale, the solution has to be at a global scale, right? So in a sense, the climate crisis kind of cut through this debate that was happening. And I don't, everybody sort of agrees, I think, on this, that like, it's got to be fixed at the global scale, right? Well, problem is, we made some real headway on that. This is the Paris Agreement that was agreed to in the International Agreement from 2015, after which there was much celebration and good feeling among the participants that we had actually finally figured out at least the beginnings of a solution, of a global solution to this problem. I attributed it to the fact that it happened in Paris, and the French knew how to give everybody lots of good food and wine, and that put everybody in a good mood, and they were finally able to reach an agreement. But in any case, but of course we know the United States is now in the process of pulling out of that agreement, which there's differing views on it, but it's certainly done an enormous amount of damage, at least in the short run, and is raising some real questions about the effectiveness of that agreement right now. So that suggests maybe the global solution isn't working so well. But there's another way in which the climate crisis sort of blows the common wisdom about these kinds of problems and what level of government they should be dealt with out of the water, because the other piece of this is that not only do all of those theories that I had up before say, this kind of the climate crisis has to be dealt with at the global level, right? It also says, like, nobody else is going to be incentivized to deal with it, right? All of these theories would say no smaller level of government would be incentivized to try to deal with a problem that's global in scale like this, right? Because they would be worried that other countries or other jurisdictions would free ride off of their efforts and all of that. And yet, for the last couple of decades, there's just been like enormous evidence, time after time after time, we're seeing over and over again, local jurisdictions, state jurisdictions, private entities stepping forward and doing stuff to try to stave off the climate crisis in ways that all of these law professor theories would never have predicted, right? Why should one state or one city stick its neck out and do stuff to try to solve this problem if they think everybody else is just going to go ahead and keep pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere? So there's that, and here is, so this actually, this is from Bloomberg's organization, that is, it's called America's Pledge, and it basically is trying to keep track of all of the state, so all the colored states, and then the little dots represent various political and other kinds of organizations that have stepped forward to say specifically that they're still in on the Paris Agreement commitments. And so this has been used to try to reassure other countries around the world that at least some of the people in this country are still working hard to try to stem the climate crisis. Here's another example of sort of sub-national jurisdictions that are really working hard to try to fight the climate crisis despite what law professors would predict. And this is renewable energy portfolio standards, states in this country that have enacted at the state level renewable energy portfolio standards to promote renewable energy. And one of the things interesting about this map is you're seeing, it really cuts across the red and blue. This is not just the blue states doing this. So, and then, of course, if we're going to talk about things that states are doing, and we have John Dernbach here with us, we would be remiss not to mention the Pennsylvania Constitution. How many people are aware of this clause in the Pennsylvania Constitution? Some of us, but not all of us. This is our environmental rights amendment that was put in the Pennsylvania Constitution in 1971. Was essentially read as a dead letter for decades by the Pennsylvania courts to essentially not have much power to really push the government to do much in the way of environmental protection. And then just in the last couple of years, in a series of Pennsylvania Supreme Court decisions that I should say cited and quoted Professor Dernbach here at great length, because while everyone else was just ignoring this provision, and I think it was the 1990s, and saying, it's just a dead letter, it'll never amount to anything, John was busily writing law review articles talking about what it might look like if it did amount to something, and lo and behold, along comes the Pennsylvania Supreme Court just a few years ago in two landmark decisions, and says, nope, we think it means something along the lines of what Professor Dernbach said. And I mention that here because there are ongoing proceedings right now that John is involved with to try to push the Pennsylvania state government to adopt a cap-and-trade program to limit greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Pennsylvania, pursuant to this provision in our state constitution. So this is all to say, what's going on here? I mean, so climate change challenges the sort of old view of this stuff, both because subnational actors actually do stuff when you wouldn't expect them to do it. But then the other thing that's so crazy that's happened in the last couple of decades is we've seen a flip of the old political alignment, right? So I told you back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, it was the liberals saying we want, action at the federal level, and it was the conservatives saying, no, we want action at the state and local level. Well, now that has flipped in many instances, and we have all these examples of situations where you've got industry and conservatives fighting for federal regulation and control, and in many instances, actual preemption that would prevent state and local governments from taking action on climate and environmental related matters. And you've got the progressives fighting back against that, states saying states' rights and local rights. We ought to be able to do something. And I think there's sort of three things going on. One is I think these sort of rational actor models that law professors are fond of, it's become increasingly apparent in recent years that they don't adequately explain actual human behavior, that we're not all just sort of profit-maximizing machines who only do things for self-interested reasons. And then it's also become very apparent in recent years that political failure can happen sort of at any level of government. And that one of the virtues of our federal system of government, right, where all power is not in a single national government, but is shared between the federal government and the state governments, is that it allows for another set of checks and balances. We usually think of checks and balances as between the branches of the federal government or any given government, but there's also a really important check that can happen sort of between the federal and the state government. And then finally, the final thing that climate change sort of just makes clear about all of this is that, or the way in which climate change just sort of challenges the old view, is that climate change is about a problem that is just fundamental to our economy, right? Fossil fuels are fundamental to our economy. And because of that, rules and laws and things that sort of favor a fossil fuel-driven economy are just pervasive and widespread throughout our legal system and our economy and our society, sort of hiding in all sorts of nooks and crannies, right? So it turns out, oh, yes, and it turns out that in order to fix this problem, you can't just do it at the international level or just at the federal level. Like even if, we rejoin the Paris Agreement and we get a federal government that's really committed to doing all sorts of stuff to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, passing a carbon tax or whatever, it turns out that's not going to be enough, right? So when I'm saying think globally, act locally, I'm not just saying it as like a stopgap because the international and federal efforts seem to be on hold right now because there's been such a vacuum of leadership at those levels. That's not what I'm saying. Because the fact is that even if we get good laws at the federal level and effective international treaties, we're still going to need all kinds of action at the state and local level. And the good news is, as John already said in his introductory remarks, there's a book that shows us exactly how to do it. And this is the book that John Dernbach co-authored that he mentioned at the outset. But it's literally a book that's about finding all the nooks and crannies throughout our legal system, throughout our society and economy, where these various rules that are stymieing the transition to a green economy are hidden, and figuring out how to change them in order to sort of smooth the way to changing the way that we produce energy in this economy, right? I mean, so one very simple example of what I'm talking about why you could have all the carbon taxes in the world at the federal level and you would still need to take local action, is my mother-in-law out in the suburbs of Philadelphia trying to put solar collectors on her roof about 10 years ago after her mother died and she got a little bit of an inheritance and she said, I'm gonna put solar collectors on her roof. Well, then she found out that the homeowners association had a rule, right? It was right there in the covenants that went with their property in this housing development, said you can't put anything on the roof. And so, I mean, they did. They eventually managed to get the solar collectors up there, but first they had to go through a whole process to change the rules that govern the homeowners association. So when I say local, I'm not just talking like the city of Harrisburg or the city of Philadelphia. I mean local, like at every level. Local meaning your homeowners association, or local meaning Widener University, or whatever individual, not just unit of government, but institution you might be part of, where you could try to push for these little tweaks that will help to smooth the way. So another way of saying what I'm saying is that there's a whole, there in particular, these three pieces of the decarbonization puzzle that are intensely local, that have, throughout the history of this country, been delegated to state and local control by our federal system, right? And that's land use, transportation, and building codes. These are all things that don't happen at the federal level. They happen at the state and local level. And this gives you a little flavor for that, right? This is just all CO2 emissions by which sector of the economy they come from. And you can see like more than a third is coming just from buildings, right? And so building codes, which are usually set at the state level and also at the local level, are absolutely crucial to this. And of course, transportation is a great example. And transportation, sure, there's federal funding and so on and so forth, but another piece of transportation is land use, right? I mean, and going back to my example of like we put in place a big federal carbon tax, let's say, that raises the price of gasoline in order to incentivize all of us to not drive as much. Well, you can't stop driving if your community is laid out in such a way that you got to get in your car to get anywhere, right? And so zoning and land use decisions are absolutely crucial to figuring out how to give people other kinds of transportation options. So that was my first of my three reasons to act locally, was that this is not just what we do while we're waiting for the federal government to act. This is something absolutely crucial that has to happen regardless of what the federal government does. And then my second reason, remember, was it will make you happy. And this is my attempt at pictures to show you being happy. I don't know if they are convincing to you, but the idea here is just this stuff that happens at the local level about sort of changing our communities to make them cleaner, to make them more walkable, to make them more bikeable. This is really cool stuff. Like, this is really optimistic and happy stuff that has to do with literally making all of our day-to-day lives better and nicer. And I think I first started thinking about this a number of years ago. I've been teaching for a number of years a seminar on climate change law and policy at Temple, and it's organized so we sort of start at the beginning of the semester with the international stuff, and then we gradually narrow down, so we look at federal and then state. And then by the end of the semester, very last class of the semester, we always talk about local sustainability initiatives in Philadelphia. And I've often noticed that that's the class in which my students seem to get the most engaged and excited and interested, even though it's the last class of the spring semester, when in some ways their minds should just be on graduation or whatever. So I really do think there's an optimism to shifting the focus to local initiatives. And then finally, I said it'll make you less, and these are just more happy pictures. This doesn't give me my captions. This is a building in Italy, in Milan, that's called an urban forest. This is this idea of urban forests, and there's a whole town that they've planned in China that's supposed to be the first forest city. But, this is cool stuff. So my third thing is it'll make you less mad. Why do I say focusing on the local level will make you less mad? I think that working at the local level has a real capacity to cut through the culture wars. And for a couple of reasons. One is that once you start working at the local level, one thing that happens is you start thinking about adaptation issues as well as mitigation issues, right? So not just thinking about how do you prevent the causes of climate change by reducing emissions, but also thinking about how do we adapt to those effects of climate change that have already become inevitable. And once you start thinking about that is in itself, the adaptation question is an intensely local question. It's a question that you actually can't really think about as easily at the federal level because it's different in every community what the impacts of climate change will be and how they will affect the community. So this is just a chart showing, a projection for Philadelphia about how many more days over 95 degrees we can expect to see in the coming years. And this is also another visual from Philadelphia showing where we can see literally what are the areas of the city that would be underwater at the blue is 2 feet of sea level rise and a Category 1 storm. But the point here is to show you, once you're thinking about okay, what are the impacts on our particular city, our locality actually going to be? Now you're thinking in terms of, individual people's properties and property rights, and you're thinking about concrete solutions to try to protect people's property rights. And I really think that has the capacity to sort of reach across the political divide and bring people together that might otherwise be on opposite sides of the political divide. And I think the same is true generally of just sustainability initiatives at the local level. I mean, once you're talking about sort of concrete, practical solutions, I think it's a lot easier to generate excitement and consensus across the spectrum. So I'm just going to close out with a few of the cool things that are happening in Philadelphia, and I'm sure there's also interesting stuff happening out here. But these power purchase agreements are becoming increasingly prevalent, where institutions and cities and towns are literally paying to have large solar farms or wind farms built. In this case, it's going to be actually in Adams County outside the city of Philadelphia, but it's going to provide 20% of the government of the city of Philadelphia's power. And this is actually going to save money for the city. So this is just, that's cool stuff. Here's SEPTA putting a whole bunch of solar collectors on big flat roofs at some of its maintenance facilities for buses and trains. Here's SEPTA getting a whole bunch of electric buses in Philadelphia. There's a small composting initiative that's getting started in Philadelphia that hopes to expand, where there will be in different neighborhoods compost facilities where neighbors can bring their food scraps from the kitchen and compost them in a community compost bin. And then, there's been some great stuff with respect to building efficiency in the state of Pennsylvania, actually, after 10 years of gridlock on this issue. And here in Harrisburg, there was just a couple of years ago a bill passed that updates the building codes in Pennsylvania in a way that means that new buildings will be significantly more energy efficient than they were before. And Philadelphia, it actually gave Philadelphia authority to update even more, which is going to mean for Philadelphia a 33% improvement in the energy efficiency of new buildings in Philadelphia. So this is just a little sampling. But I'm hoping that it gives you a sense of what I'm saying when I think that this local focus can help us to sort of reach across the political divide and be a little less mad and a little more happy. So did I end on a little bit of a happier note than I started? All right. Well, thank you very much for listening, and I think there's time for some questions.
So the way we ordinarily proceed is we'll take questions until maybe 5 o'clock or a few minutes after 5. Go ahead, you can call it what you see fit.
So could you go back to that happy picture of the people with the walking and bicycling?
Oh, yeah, sure. That's a good one.
So I look at this, all right? My generation, we are the sandwich generation. We're taking care of kids, we're taking care of elderly relatives, and when you think about happy solutions, you have to remember what we lack most,
Yeah,
time.
right.
I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, that's miserable because I'm stuck in traffic. And look at all these young kids running around. These aren't people who have, kids at home and who are caring for elderly parents. So now you say.
Well, wait a minute.
Now,
You're...
just let me finish. So now you say, well, what would be a solution? Okay, here you are. You want to save on energy.
Yeah.
What would be a solution that takes that other method, that other variable, time, which is absolutely fixed.
Yeah.
You can never get back.
Yeah.
And I would say you should put up a picture of someone like me working happily at home.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Because
no, I get that.
then
Sure.
I'm not commuting, right? And I'm
Yeah.
there to take care of
And
kids and
It's interesting that you say that because there's that, what's that website, John? I think it's called, is it Project Drawdown that I'm thinking of? There's a really great website that has various things that can be done and then gives an estimate of, like, globally, if we did X, Y, or Z, we put up more wind farms or whatever, like how much we would get in terms of greenhouse gas reduction. And if I remember right, they have a whole list of like 80 different things that could be done. And that's one of them is telecommuting, right? So in other words, that is an important solution that people talk about in this context. I mean, and I think you're right. I think it's a great idea. Yeah.
one of the things is all of us lobby the Commonwealth, which is fixated on you must be at work or else you're not working, to encourage more home
Oh,
headquarters.
because a lot of you here in this area obviously work for the Commonwealth. No, I'm getting it. I'm getting it. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that the greenhouse gas emissions reduction that you can get by allowing people to telecommute is now becoming a more and more powerful argument that you can make to employers, and especially government employers who have all sorts of reasons for needing to be able to brag that they're reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, right? So, I mean, I would say that's a good argument to make. Absolutely.
I think most of the studies that have been done have shown that productivity increases with people working at home and not decreases. I
Right.
think there's studies out there. My daughter works from home like 3 days a week, and her employer was also concerned about that. She works for a private company. But they found that productivity was better.
It's interesting that you say that because when the private sector, it's easy enough to see. But, in the government, you don't have the same proxy for profits.
Yeah.
Right.
It's harder to
And
measure productivity.
It's harder to
Right.
measure productivity, but,
Right.
we have certain people in our HR department, they know when you come in, they go around at 4:30 to make sure you're still there. In fact, I got myself in trouble because I told them, if that's all you're gonna do, we should fire you and replace you with a time clock. And the new ones go by fingerprint. And you don't have to pay benefits to time clock, and it'll help our pension crisis, right? Because we have fewer people. They didn't like that solution.
You're a troublemaker.
Absolutely.
Yeah, over here.
Proud of it.
I was just going to piggyback on both of them. I've done all of them. I worked for the state, and then I left and went to corporate America, and went from that corporate America job to another corporate America job, and those two corporate America jobs are the exact same thing. The first one, I had to be in the office. The one I'm in currently is full-time work from home. I
That's
see my
interesting.
boss maybe twice a year.
That's
if we feel
interesting.
like it.
Right. Do you know whether the company you work for has thought about trying to use the greenhouse gas emissions that are being saved as sort of a selling point to the public? This is something they could be bragging about.
I mean, it's known that they are very telecommute friendly.
Yeah.
It's Aetna, CVS.
Right.
Before I worked for Highmark. I'm like, I'll throw them all out there. Highmark refused it. Aetna, now CVS.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, so I'm like, it's known. You can
Right.
Google
Right.
work from home jobs. It's one of the top ones listed.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
they use it. We're all over the country, all over the world.
But this gets at what I was trying to say about how, this transition to the decarbonized economy just it puts its tendrils into absolutely every aspect of life. And so there's all these, and this is part of why I think this stuff is so fun to think about and optimistic, because there's all kinds of creative solutions that actually are part of this broader project of trying to decarbonize, right? And it's good stuff that actually changes our day-to-day life. Yeah, in the back. Yes. No, that's absolutely right. And when you do those charts, like I had at the beginning, of which country is producing more greenhouse gas emissions, it can be misleading from that perspective, right? Because some of those emissions are coming from manufacturing of goods that are then getting shipped to consumers in this country. That's absolutely right. Is to buy locally. Yeah, no, that's right.
I just want to say, I looked at some of your articles from like 15 years ago, and you were pretty prophetic, So did you ever feel like sort of Churchill did in the, the 30s, warning about? I mean, you're very positive, but you could be doing an "I told you so" thing, I think. But do you feel optimistic? I mean, you're trying to be optimistic. Do you feel optimistic?
Do I feel optimistic? That really depends on the day. But no, I don't always feel optimistic. I feel very despairing sometimes. But I do, personally, like one of the things I did this year to try to do what I was talking about a little bit was to start a committee at the law school about sustainability issues. And I just have to say, Professor, we like to complain about these committees we have to be on all the time. It's like not our favorite part of the job, but this committee is like the most fun committee because, I don't know, we're just, because it's this practical stuff about day-to-day life and its solutions, and it feels like you're actually doing something that could actually make a difference. And so when I'm doing that, I'm in a good mood.
Add with the amount of emissions that were related to transportation.
Yeah.
This is going to sound very strange, but I was listening to something on the radio today or yesterday that said that Qantas Airline is going to have this huge hit on their profits because of the coronavirus.
Oh, yeah.
And I was wondering, since airlines contribute a lot to transportation,
Yeah.
will we be able to more clearly identify the degree to which airlines affect emissions by the drop-off in this quarter?
Oh, I don't think that's that measurement problem is not a big problem. One of the convenient things about CO2 emissions is that the amount of the number of molecules of CO2 that is released into the atmosphere by burning a particular quantity of fuel is easy to calculate as a matter of basic chemistry, because all these fossil fuels are just these big, for those who remember organic chemistry, like they're these, what? Yeah. I think I might have taken it, but I don't remember it that clearly. But it's this, it's some big molecule. It's got a bunch of C's and H's. And anyway, it's actually just basic chemistry. And so those kinds of estimates of like how much CO2 is coming from the airline industry are not particularly hard to make or controversial. But those emissions from the airline industry are particularly hard to reduce. And that is, you put your finger on one of the most thorny problems from a technological standpoint in terms of reducing emissions. For a lot of emissions, like we've got great technologies and we need to just start scaling them up, stuff like solar collectors and wind turbines and all that great stuff. But with airplanes, you can't, you can have an electric car because we have good battery technology. But the batteries are heavy, I guess. And so you actually can't, if you try to put batteries in an airplane, it can't lift off the ground anymore. And so I think at this point, they're just looking at alternative fuels like biofuels, which can reduce CO2 emissions. But it's a problem. It's a real problem. I will say that the airline industry has recently, I think, started to take the problem more seriously than they did before. And part of it is because they've seen a drop-off in sales, not only because of the coronavirus, but even before that, the flight shaming movement in Europe that started to happen, as a result of people like Greta Thunberg saying, well, you people shouldn't be flying in airplanes because it's so much greenhouse gas emissions, and I'm going to take a sailboat across the Atlantic Ocean and all that. It actually, there's been a dip in airline sales in Europe that I think is attributable to that flight shaming. And so you are seeing a reaction from the industry. But that is a really important piece of that transportation wedge in the chart. Kurt?
Is it in other or in industry?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that.
And the follow-up is, how important is curtailing the growth in animal ag to reaching the goals of, use the...
I think it's huge. I think it's huge because, the stuff you see about eating red meat and the greenhouse gases that are associated with that in comparison even to chicken or then to a vegetarian diet are just huge, right? And so that suggests that wherever it is in that chart, and I don't know, it's a really big piece of the puzzle. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's true. I do think, though, the food thing I just think is complicated in terms of messaging, because I do think that the fossil fuel industry that's fighting for its life right now, and has been working very hard to try to sow doubt about the science of climate change and so on, they would like nothing more than for people to become convinced that anybody who is worrying about the climate crisis and telling you that something has to be done about it is going to, first thing they're going to do is take away your hamburgers and your Caribbean vacations and all that stuff. So I do think you have to be a little careful, right? Because I think focusing too much on that, on the hamburgers, can really turn people off from the movement. So while I do think it's great for those people who can cut down on their red meat consumption, I think that's great. I try not to harp on it too much.
Recent book?
I don't know, what does he say?
Well, he says that it's the inconvenient truth that even Al Gore's people will not talk about.
Oh,
basically, we can't succeed.
No, it's true. I think he's right. And I do think we should, I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about it, I'm just saying I think you have to be careful how you talk about it, right? Because you become that sort of shrill person that nobody wants to listen to because you're blaming people for their lifestyle. I think you got to be careful of that. That's all. But yeah, no, I think it's an issue for sure. But it's also an issue that's getting some solutions, like that burger, that magic burger or whatever it is they're serving at McDonald's now, right? So There's a ton of my students who are vegan. It's incredible. The younger generation is really, really shifting on these issues. Yeah.
So I had just been listening to a podcast on my way to school here tonight, and there was this woman who had just come back from Antarctica with the 70-degree temperature,
Yeah.
and she had mentioned that the scientists that have been doing all these studies have drastically underestimated the effects of climate change, and you said there's a good 10-year span that we have to really just turn this whole planet around.
Yeah.
And routinely, a measure to do half measures rather to meet certain standards because there's pushback. So how do we reconcile that? Are we just shifting water out of a sinking boat? I just feel
I think there's just no question that we got to do as much as we possibly can do. And, the more we can do, the better. I mean, it's not like you get to a point where you should give up, because at whatever, 1.5 degrees of warming is better than 2 degrees of warming. But 2 degrees of warming is better than 3 degrees, and 3 degrees is better than 4 degrees, and 4 degrees. So you just got to keep bailing, right? But I know what you're talking about. I mean, I've been following the issue for many years, and it often does feel to me like like you more often hear the story that says the scientists have been underestimating how bad things are than you hear the story that says, oh, good news, actually they were overestimating, it's not so bad. So, that's sobering for sure. That's sobering. And I mean, and it's true that there's also, one of the things that's shifted so much in this issue just in the last year or two, two things. Like, people have been talking about it in a more emotional way than they used to, right? And actually, I think Greta Thunberg is one of the people that has maybe broken the ice on that more than anybody, because she's so angry. So people are sort of talking about the emotions in a way that didn't used to happen. And maybe partly because the people talking about this were scientists, and scientists aren't supposed to talk about emotion. They're supposed to be objective and so forth. People are talking about emotions, but people are talking about negative emotions of like real depression and despair. And I think that really is a real problem that we have to grapple with, I mean, and that's part of what I'm responding to, is we got to figure out ways to keep charging ahead even when things seem a little bit, sometimes seem a little grim. See, now you got me back in less happy territory again. That's not how I wanted to end. One more question, if there is one. Oh, yeah.
May I ask what the first slide of your presentation shows? Is that you yourself, Professor?
Oh, I wish it was.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm shameless about just ripping these things off. So this thing I ripped off of Bloomberg himself. But you know why I did? Because the scene to me looked a little bit reminiscent of central Pennsylvania. Like, it was pretty. And I thought it was cool, so.
Let's give Professor Sinden one last round of applause.